Hello, everybody. First of all, welcome to the session. Thank you for coming along to this session in the Rethinking Economics International Festival 2021. The first thing that I'll say is I have a late addition as chair to this session. I just want to say that the work of this session has principally been done by one of our organisers called Mila, who unfortunately hasn't been able to come today. So all the work and thinking that has gone behind this session, the plaudits go to her rather than to me. But let's get started. So the session today that you've joined is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the digital divide? A review of the digital divide in 2021. Now, I'm sure that we'll all know that the digital divide is not a new phenomenon. The restrictions that a lack of access to digital facilities and resources, the effect that that has principally on communities in the global south, marginalised communities around the world, is a phenomenon that has existed, maybe someone would correct me, but I'd say as long as the internet and digital resources have been prevalent. But the last year has made this problem particularly acute. The move onto digital technologies brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic has made this digital divide worse. And not only is there a continued lack of access to better technologies within marginalised communities, a lack of digital infrastructure in lots of countries and communities around the world, and the continued high cost of data, but these are problems that are getting worse and exacerbated by the current state that we're in. And I'm really delighted to be joined today by three speakers who engage and are involved in this field of research and field of work. And we're going to be looking today at not only the current state of the digital divide, what it looks like at present, but also thinking about what some of these solutions might be and what some of the resolutions might be to this problem. So we are, I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers, but I will just say that if you have anything that you would like to add to this discussion, you can find the chat bar on the side of the screen. So post away there. If you have particular questions that you would like to add and add to this discussion, put them on the Q&A tab. And then once we've heard from each of our speakers in turn, we will then break up into a bit of a discussion where they'll be able to answer your questions. So the first person that I'm really delighted to welcome to the session and to the stage is Teddy Woodhouse. Teddy Woodhouse is Research Manager for Access and Affordability at the Web Foundation. And he also focuses his time on the Alliance for Affordable Internet's research program. He coordinates their research projects, conducts original analysis, and uses this research to support the organization's mission. And we're really delighted to have him today. So Teddy, if you'd like to unmute yourself and turn on your screen, we're really looking forward to hear from you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ross. Hopefully folks can hear me all right and see me all right. I'm going to quickly bring up my slides. So yeah, as Ross mentioned, I'm a researcher at the Alliance for Affordable Internet. I just want to give a brief presentation about kind of some of the work that we do and some of the kind of materials we work with day by day in my line of work. I'm not an economist by training, nor could I even have enough skills to pretend I am an economist. But I am a big fan of Rethinking Economics' work and actually got to attend one of the festivals in previous years. And it was very much like being a child in the deep waters, fascinating, but also terrifying. Onto my presentation. In short, if there's going to be 4 words that I want you to remember from my presentation, it is that the digital divide is sexist. And what I'm going to go into is a bit about how the digital divide works, how we understand it, and how gender can be such a overwhelmingly influential factor in how someone is experiencing the internet and determining what kind of access, or even if they have access to the internet in the first place. And so to explain a bit about that, my presentation kind of fits into 4 parts. It's kind of thinking about internet access as the divide. It's thinking about affordability as part of the divide, and it's also thinking about contents and skills as part of the divide. And then I do want to leave on a positive note in my short time that I have, talking about what is the kind of world we want and what are some trajectories we could take to move out from the status quo. So to briefly introduce my organization, the Alliance for Affordable Internet, we are the world's broadest technology sector alliance. So we combined governments, private sector, civil society as well, all together, working together to drive down the price of broadband by focusing on and transforming policy and regulatory frameworks. So that's really where we focus on, is thinking about how do we set up positive policy environments and strong markets that lead to, typically more affordable prices for more people across the globe. And we focus a lot of our work in low and middle income countries. And kind of an example of some of the work we do is the affordability report from a couple of years ago looked at market competition in particular, and how competitive a market is going to be in a country will affect the pricing in that market. And so you'll see here is kind of a quick snapshot of, in general, as more people are coming online and as the digital economy is becoming kind of a more interesting space generally, more companies are coming in and more service providers are coming in. And so markets are becoming generally more competitive throughout the world, although disparities do exist in many parts as well. But thinking first, going back to the digital divide, how we're understanding it now, what we look at, this is probably, if you're asking someone in my field, what does the digital divide look like? This is the top line figure. These are from the International Telecommunications Union, which is the specialist United Nations body that talks about these policy issues and talks about technology from kind of a global sustainable development perspective. And so you see here, a majority of the world's men are online, but a majority of the women in the world have not yet used the internet. We're still at that kind of threshold point, very close to it, but it pulls out a very interesting disparity. If you think about what is the majority experience from these two genders, they're different. And in different parts of the world, those differences become even more vast. So you'll see at the regional comparisons in Africa, that gap grows to 20 and 37. In the Arab states as well, 47% for women, 61% for men. And in some places they're narrowing, but it's still such a huge part of life for many parts of the world, and such a huge dynamic that affects what kind of access someone is going to have. But even beyond that simple metric, so that simple metric is a measurement of how often has someone used the internet at least once in the past 3 months. And in that simple binary, it's, yes, they've used the internet, they get counted in the statistic, or no, they haven't, they're excluded from the statistic. But using the internet once in a span of 3 months is a very small experience compared to what we are experiencing here today, which is an online conference. We're all kind of live and synchronous using video and voice and understanding each other. And so we at the Alliance, in partnership with the World Wide Web Foundation, did some research around meaningful connectivity and thinking about what are some qualitative aspects of internet use that we can understand the digital divide, not just simply as a binary, but as something slightly more complex and something more intuitive. And so for us, meaningful connectivity comes when someone has a smartphone or a fancier device, when they have access to a 4G network, when they're using internet every day, and when they have access to an unlimited oasis point, as I like to call it. So at home or at work or school, you're able to use the internet kind of more deeply and more intensely than you might be able to in other parts of your life. And one of the interesting things we saw when we did some research just before the pandemic was in Colombia, Ghana, and Indonesia. In all three of those countries, the gender gap between who's using internet in that simple statistic of yes or no, and who has meaningful connectivity, in all three of those countries, the gender gap between men and women is larger. So that's that's to say that not only are more men online than women generally across the world, it is also that men have more of these attributes that are leading to kind of a richer qualitative experience online than women are as well. And so there's this multiplicity of factors that are affecting what kind of access someone is having based on their gender and how that's connected to it. So it's a really troubling part that we need to keep in mind, that this kind of infrastructural issue has a gendered lens to it. But in addition to the infrastructure itself, thinking then about affordability, that second point I wanted to talk about. This is a nice big global map. So one of the things that we do at the Alliance is we collect data now in partnership with the ITU. And so this map, as of this year, will start being global, but this is the kind of most recent year we've published that has about 100 countries. And it shows kind of how affordable or unaffordable mobile data is in many parts of the world. This is a national figure, and so it's kind of a very simple temperature check at the national level. But if you dig down into that, and which is one of the things that we've started doing at the Alliance, then we see how that estimated affordability of 1 gigabyte of mobile broadband, which we say at a national level should be no more than 2% of the average monthly income. If you break those down by quintiles, so here you see kind of the poorest 20%, then the second poorest, and then kind of middle, and then the kind of two richer quintiles as well. Even in all of these 6 countries, at the national level, they have reached that international target of 1 for 2. But if you look at the poorest quintiles, the experience is vastly different, particularly in stark situations such as South Africa. For the poorest 40% of society, it's 5% or even more than 10% of the average monthly income to afford just 1 gigabyte of data, which is roughly the amount of data that someone is going to use simply listening to this session on a mobile network. So simply just that is going to cost 10% of someone's monthly income in South Africa. That's a huge amount of money and shows how affordability has such a overwhelming impact in terms of whether someone's going to connect to the internet in the first place, or it's simply going to be considered a luxury that they can never afford. But with that, again, gender plays a role. And this is, again, another element in which the digital divide is sexist. If you look at gender pay gaps, and so here we used data from the International Labour Organization, which did estimates of countries of how pay disparities between men and women. The orange bars show national affordability, and generally with affordability, you want to have the target as low as possible. And then the green bars, you see women's affordability. So it is roughly an estimate of, for the average woman who is earning income in that country, how much of her income is she going to need to pay to get that 1 gigabyte? And in all 5 of these countries where the data was available, women are paying more than the indicative national average. So again, it's this hidden disparity of women are paying a little bit more each time to stay connected. They're having to do a little bit more work a little bit harder to stay connected compared to kind of the national average, or how we understand these things at a very simple, high level. And so that covers those first 2 points of access and how those infrastructural questions are divided by gender, and also affordability and how income by gender, again, is affecting women in a negative way as we understand the digital divide. The third one I want to point out is drawing back to this report on women's rights online, which says it's not just about the infrastructure, it's not just about money. Even when women are overcoming these barriers, they are, in general, less likely to post and produce content online. They're less likely to be social. They're less likely to be selling or participating in the digital economy. And those are all the statistics you see in that first table on the top. And then the second one underneath, women, again, are also generally much more concerned about personal privacy and cybersecurity. So in turn, it's the balance of those two things of just simply being online is much more dangerous activity for a woman by self-perception and in many ways in reality, even when all these infrastructural issues are overcome. And so the combination of all of these things, of infrastructure, of affordability or unaffordability, and of kind of the actual experiences of being online as a woman, accumulate into this deeply sexist experience where it is to be a woman online is a much starker and more brutal situation than it is for kind of the national average as we understand it. And so that's why we are committed and really advocate for in our work for re-understanding and rethinking the digital divide, particularly as we're coming out of the pandemic, particularly as we're thinking about how men and women have disparate experiences through the pandemic as well. That it's not just about infrastructure, it's not just about digital economy in a kind of in a lens that doesn't think about gender. You have to think about, we call it react. You have to think about rights for women and breaking social norms that say women and girls shouldn't have mobile phones. It's about education and skills so that, everyone's able to receive a good education and do creative things online, no matter their background, relevant content, and that includes sexual and reproductive health as a kind of area that's very politically sensitive, but it's necessary for so many people and so many communities across the globe. And also targets is another thing. A lot of this data is quite unique, and having gender disaggregated data in these areas can be quite rare. And so governments need to be more honest and more accountable in terms of collecting data, reporting that data to understand these areas, and then set targets to set policies that are going to change the world in the next few years. And so this is kind of the framework that we use when we kind of start thinking about these questions, and we start thinking about how do we understand the digital divide and how do we confront the deep sexist nature of the digital divide as well. And so I will stop here. Thank you again for your time. And I will looking forward to the conversation with the other panelists and other interventions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Teddy, for that. And yeah, if you have thoughts, questions, anything that you'd like to remember and then bring into discussion afterwards, use that chat and Q&A function. But I'm not going to be on the screen for long because I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Beatrice Busanacci, who is an Argentine free information and human rights activist. She is the founder of Fundación Vía Libre and has written for the publication La Nación. She is also the co-founder of the Argentine chapter of the Wikimedia Foundation and is the head of the Creative Commons Argentina team. If you would like to turn on your camera and unmute yourself, it's great to have you.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you very much, and thank you, Teddy, for this very interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to read that report. So it's very interesting, and one of my main concerns, the gender issue on the digital divide. Thank you, Rethinking Economics, for the invitation. It's my first time in this festival, and as I could see in this 3 days, it's a very interesting scenario to debate many of the things we usually debate in the human rights and tech community. So thank you for bringing me here and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about these issues. I'm not an economist by formation. My background is in mass communication and intellectual property. So I will bring that perspective to the floor. First of all, I would put the concept of digital divide on the table, because at Vía Libre Foundation, we have a very critical approach of this concept, and we invite you to think in a critical approach to this concept. This concept was a very, very common language in the World Summit on the Information Society that was held in Geneva in 2003, where I took part in 2 caucuses, which were very, very critical for the Information Society and the digital divide. One was the Education Caucus for civil society, and the other was the Intellectual Property Caucus for from the civil society, which I consider are 2 of the main issues we have to consider when we talk about digital divide. First, I would like to replace the concept of digital divide for the most common concept of inequality. As we've already seen in Ted's presentation, the issue at stake is inequality between men and women, inequality between North and South, inequality between social classes, inequality between workers in the informal markets, which we know a lot in the global South and in Latin America especially. So I would like to talk about inequality, and of course, digital divide is one of the main areas of this inequality in this context of information society, post-industrial society, surveillance society, as Shoshana Zuboff usually conceptualized this historic period. digital divide is not only about having or not having access to internet, because, for example, those who follow the World Summit on the Information Society, we know that this idea of access to internet is also of interest for many of the big tech corporations, which have their big business depending on this access to internet. So it is a concept that promotes, when we just promote access, we are talking about we are not talking about many other things that could make a difference in this access. And inequality is how do we access the internet? Which are the conditions in which we access the internet? It's not just access, which is necessary, but not enough. So it's not that it's not access, but it's access plus many other things. And I would like to talk about these other things. First, the first thing I would like to add is the capacity building, especially in the Global South. And what are we talking about when we talk about capacity building? For example, is in the capacities you have. So you could develop your own infrastructures, your own decisions in accessing software. For example, if we talk about reducing the digital divide by just using the services provided by the big tech, we are not doing anything against inequality, but we are also feeding inequality. The UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, published a report this year in April or May regarding the big gap between the developed countries and the undeveloped countries in the technological era. In this last decades, the gap between the rich countries and the poor countries have broadened, even while the poor countries were improved their economic conditions. So what we have to see is that this digital economy is deepening inequalities when you see it in a history perspective, because we are feeding the concentration, we are feeding the only winners of the COVID-19 pandemics, which are this technological sector represented by the big tech, or what we usually call the GAFA, the Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. These are the big winners from the pandemic, and the rest of the economy are the big losers in the pandemic. And I would like to put something else on the table, which is the issue on intellectual property. We cannot talk about digital divide, we cannot talk about inequality in the access to knowledge, in the production of knowledge, without talking about intellectual property. And intellectual property is one of the main problems of inequality between the North and the South. Intellectual property is, for example, in countries like Argentina, which I know a lot because it's where I live and where I do my research. Argentina, for example, has one of the most restrictive intellectual property laws in the world. When I'm talking about intellectual property here, I'm talking about copyright and related rights, not about patents, especially. We could also talk about that if you have any questions. But when I said intellectual property here is the copyright and related rights, because that's the name of our law here in Argentina. For example, the impact of COVID-19 in education was so strong because most of the schools went, the students went to study at home. Mostly in the last year, we didn't have classes in the school, so we have remote classes last year, and in the half year this 2021 we are having a bimodal system where some kids are at home, some others are at school, so they build bubbles, so they have social distancing and the capacity to keep these distances at schools. So we have to move most of our educational system to remote classes. But we didn't have any flexibility or any exception for educational materials. For example, our intellectual property laws is very, very strict on prohibition to make copies, even if those copies are for non-profit uses or educational uses. So in Argentina, for example, every teacher, every professor, and every student doing remote classes last year and this year is in violation of the intellectual property law. And that is for local situation. If we consider the international situation, the gap between rich countries and developing countries in development, like Argentina, like the rest of Latin America, and like Africa, like many countries in Asia, the inequalities regarding intellectual property are huge. So we cannot talk about digital divide without talking about intellectual property, without talking about capacity building, and without talking about strategies to deal with these problems on intellectual property and capacity building and concentration. And of course, another concept which I would like to bring to the table, which is interoperability. Just to add some examples to what Teddy mentioned before, in the free software and the free culture community, the inequality, the gap between men and women is huge. As I consider myself a Wikipedian, one of members of the Wikipedia community, I could testimony that 1 to 10 Wikipedians is a woman. The gender gap in producing contents for Wikipedia is huge. It's 9 to 1. It's one of the main gender gaps we've seen in many areas. The free software community, which I also consider a member, since 20 years now, I'm running new Linux on my computer. I'm using free software to have this conversation with you. There is also a deep gender gap. But this means that we have to build a lot of education regarding this free culture, free software, interoperability, and that we need to build to have a strong policy on capacity building, so we can make our own decisions, not only as individuals, but as society, as communities. And that's why we usually think about free software, free culture, and all the debate on free access to knowledge we usually present from the Creative Commons community and the free software community and the free culture community. So first, just to synthesize my perspective and to give the floor to the rest and to listen to your questions. First, I would like to replace the idea of digital divide by the concept of inequality, which I think it is a broader concept that help us see the multidimensional issues regarding these problems, which is not only access, but access, participation, a contribution, and appropriation of knowledge. The second thing I would like to add is that we need to consider concentration and capacity building and competition and interoperability as issues that the state has to pay attention to, because the only winners in these pandemics is the big tech, which are multiplying their ganancias. It's in Spanish. I'm sorry, I lost the word. And then they are multiplying their incomes, and while the rest of the world is impovering. So we have to think about how we deal with the intellectual property debate, especially, and I would like to close with this, with the support of the intellectual property waiver that is being discussed at the WTO in these days. So these are the main concepts I would like to bring to the table. It's inequality, intellectual property, concentration, and a critical perspective on digital divide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, and yeah, really interesting way of problematizing some of these questions that tech throws up. And I think questions that we're definitely going to return to in the discussion and the Q&A. But before we move on to that, I am really excited to welcome our third and final speaker of this session, Benjamin Akiyomoje, who is a self-described ICT 4D enthusiast. That is information communications technology for development. He's a PhD informatics student at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. Benjamin's research areas are persuasive technology, using health application for stress management among Namibian university students. He's also member of a number of West African and international networks that focus on issues of ICT 4D, and we're really delighted to have him here. The floor is yours, Benjamin.
Thank you. Can you see my slide? I hope you can see it. I hope it doesn't hide this.
Yeah, we can see your slide. We can't see your slide when you're on that slide, but that'll hurt people's heads.
Okay.
But if you go on the tab with the slide on it, we can see them.
Okay, so today, good afternoon, everyone. This is my first time at Rethink, and it's a rare privilege for me. And also, I'm not an economist, but I just want to thank Teddy and Beatrice. They've really talked about what I've been thinking about. So I just want to bring my own reality as a PhD student and somebody who has all of his life advocating for technology as something that can really help communities to leapfrog, especially with social innovation. So let me just tell you about my own understanding. I believe that COVID-19 unmute digital divide. It just let the digital divide has been there before to have a voice. And that was the title of my presentation. So if you look at, I'm not for statistics. I mean, Terry has shown us all the statistics that we need to see. And I see if I knew I couldn't compete on that. But just like Beatrice said, digital divide had these definitions of access to and the use of new media between the so-called information haves and have-nots. That was the old definition, but in recent times it has just been inequalities in internet access. Pretty much that's what it is. But I like the fact that Beatrice said not just the access, the environment to which you get the access. And that speaks to this picture I'm displaying on this slide. You can see that is people living in shacks, informal settlement. And that is as beautiful and wonderful as Namibia is. Over 500,000 people live in those shacks out of a 2.5 million thereabout population. So you can see where a divide is already. How can you get internet access here? How comfortable it is. The buildings are not homely friendly. If it's hot inside. If it's cold inside. So what do you want to do with the internet in that kind of environment? The same thing about rural dwellers in a place like Nigeria, almost 50% of Nigerians live in the rural areas, which simply means it's not attractive to telcos, and they are probably sparsely populated such that signals don't get to them. So that is another aspect. Again, you see another inequality, that people who are in the rural area. So they said 28% of Africa has access to internet. So we know that rural and low-income communities, people just fall immediately into that inequality gap, and they are there. They have to decide between either to buy data or to feed. And these things are not just good for presentation, but I practically have witnessed it in two countries that I've been familiar with in the past 5 years, and then also this past 2 years during COVID-19. So I'm looking at Namibia, what has been happening, because I currently stay there. And then I'm also looking at Nigeria, where I come from. And I mean, always I'm communicating with my siblings, everybody, and I'm reading the news. So where are my areas of interest is digital health. My last research was on mental health, how you use mobile health to help students to manage their stress condition. And as somebody who is on a university campus, I'm currently on a university campus right now, I've seen fast, aggressive transition from face-to-face learning to e-learning. And I'm currently with a research group right now that we're reviewing, we're investigating the impact of going online around the students. Then also the vulnerable population. I mean, also vis-a-vis gender gap. I mean, like how has this pushed people who proud to now were almost invisible? Where has it pushed them to? Then being someone who is in informatics, health data and data sovereignty. All of the data, since we have been forced aggressively to go online, where are they? Who is in control of them? And how do we know we have right ownership and we can determine the future of this data, since the world is going data science crazy. The next issue is also governance. If you look at it from internet governance, our typical democracy and all of that, are we able to participate as we used to during when we didn't have the COVID-19? So it's also an area of interest to me. I'm part of, I participate actively in ICANN, which is an organization that manages the DNS, which is a very strong infrastructure for the internet. The civil society group, non-commercial user constituency, and representing Africa. And then finally, something that COVID-19 has really also unmute is misinformation, the impact around us. So these are all the areas that I'm interested in, and I just want to raise questions surrounding some of these issues. So the reality of COVID-19, you could see in that headline, e-learning gets stuck in digital divide. E-learning tried to run with, as we try to switch from physical and say pandemic is here, let's go online. And we see that e-learning didn't do fairly as people thought it would do, especially in those environments and those realities I've given to you. And also, just as we're dealing with that, pandemic also set up a huge blow on mental health, especially in an area where people didn't used to talk about it a lot. Prior to pandemic, Namibia is very susceptible to mental health. I mean, the statistic is very, very stark around here. It's like the 11th country with most suicide rates in the world. During the pandemic, it just went out of hand. I have a personal experience of a student who committed suicide just because we won't know the exact reason, but we pretty much think the pandemic had some roles to play. Also, lots of jobs. The Namibian airline national carrier was folded up during the pandemic. And this is just in the formal sector. So imagine all of the informal sectors, what has happened to them, the fruit market seller, the taxi driver, and all of that. So my question then is, if there's such a huge gap between us and the developing countries and developed countries. Why are we using the same template to address the same issue? I mean, our context should be very different. We shouldn't have the same lockdown approach as the West had. So one of the things I try to say in this slide is there's a bittersweet story with COVID-19 between last year and this year. The first thing is it pushed for the rapid adoption of technology. Prior to now, there's been a lot of conversation about the potential of what technology can help, especially Africa and in those two countries to leapfrog into the new age. However, that's what we thought. So COVID-19 really made that happen. Everybody had no choice than to get on board. Immediately, the lockdown and the social distancing came up. Then we had good things like reduction in crime because everybody was indoors. Normal things you used to see, traffic jams and things like that, they got reduced. Any other thing you could think about reduced, I mean, at least in the initial. And then also because of that, we had limited spread of the pandemic, which seems it was good because of limited infrastructure as well. We weren't moving so fast. Once you stop transportation and stop market transactions, people stayed at home. So those things made it look like it worked. But then swiftly after, people could barely stay home till a particular time. Then we started having political unrest. In some areas, GBV, gender-based violence, skyrocketed. In some other areas, there weren't problems. So it was varying. But then issues like job losses started coming up. I mean, organizations started shutting down when the lockdown stayed beyond a month. Also, we had wage cuts, lower economic power because people's incomes were cut at the expense of either staying. But then the issue of social distancing, prolonged social distancing, is not for everyone. I mean, so as I said before, children with special needs who needed people, special carers and all of that, they were left alone, who had special schools to go to, could not go, and all of these things. And because they also didn't have internet, their education suffered, and students typically, schools with poor infrastructure were totally left out. Informal job owners were left out of the mix, social distancing didn't work for them, taxis were forced to take fewer passengers, there was a limit to how much they could raise the funds, the taxi fares, and then the issues about elder citizens, people haven't been talking a lot about them. These are people who were more vulnerable, but also needed support of their family members. Now they had to live in isolation. This wasn't also very good. Then we had social support structure totally decimated. The families could not gather as usual. Religious organizations that used to support people, other kind of gatherings were nowhere to be found because those laws, those restrictions, requirements, or protocols knocked all of that out. Then for students, most students used to come to universities to use internet. Now they had to get out of their limited resources, stipends, to pay for internet. And that was hard. Even though the schools bought them devices, but remember, they only made more money for telcos because the telcos didn't really, I mean, what they offered didn't do anything. And even sometimes, many students used to go to class to learn, but now they were learning with also browsers that were showing YouTube and all of that. So many distractions all came in, and all of that we're still investigating. So as I said on this slide, digital technology is not always as good. We're beginning to see the implication of digitization and digitalization. These are totally different terms, and I would like everybody to look at the different meanings. I mean, digitization and digitalization has different impact on people. That means some people are going to lose their job, processes are going to be turned into automated, which is going to push people downward. I mean, many people are not going to have jobs. And many businesses that depend on the traditional way of doing things are going to just be cut off. And as we said, there's a whole lot of drive, especially towards many of our social systems. Education, health, agriculture are being commercialized at a very alarming rate. And just like Beatrice said, the big techs are also those who are reaping the benefits. It's like COVID-19 has given them more data points about us. So now we have no choice but just to keep dropping our data. And that also comes to the issue of data sovereignty and how prepared is Africa for data localization so that it can benefit us. And finally, also, some of these tools we are using, how culturally relevant are they? Because most of the tools, people talk about data science and all of that, they have their inherent biases and they carry over unintended consequences that we're already seeing, which is just expanding the already existing inequalities. So what are my solutions after saying all of these things? So I think COVID-19 has shown us that we need to make digital development a must. It's a must, it's something we need to deal with. And my own argument is everyone who seems to be Africa, a friend of inequality, need to genuinely support and collaborate with, I'm talking from Africa's perspective right now, to collaborate to support sustainable digital development from all angles, not just to get people to put their data online. And these are some of the solutions I think will really work. One of them is digital infrastructure investment, especially from organizations who are into, corporations who are into development, international development. They need to support infrastructure investment that would engender social innovation so that communities can develop their own culturally relevant, context relevant innovations. In this age as well, internet access is not just there, because what we're seeing is a lot of Africans are getting on, sorry to say, a lot is just for consumption of entertainment. But right now we need to see digital skill development that makes us to be able to develop technology that is available to us, that is useful to us. And then we need to renegotiate digital and data governance, how it has to go. Then the issue of how to deal with cybersecurity and misinformation so that we can participate actively and we can genuinely start working towards bridging the gap. So for me, these are some of my own thoughts and idea in the terms of where digital divide is and the way forward. I just hope that people would not only pay lip service to this term, but will actively work to try and bridge the existing gaps that we see. And I don't know to say thank you to COVID or to just blame COVID, but I think it has revealed to us what digital divide has been and has been existing among us. So thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. And if you could stop the screen share, Benjamin, but stay on the screen. And I'd just invite Teddy and Beatrice to join the stage, so to turn your cameras back on. And we've got some questions in the chat, which we'll move to in a second. But I'm going to, while I've got the mic, use the prerogative and say, first of all, thank you to everybody for some really interesting presentations. I think that maybe you'd agree that there's agreement across the different talks about the scale of the problem, but it came at it from very different lenses in a way that I think, problematizes this question of how we overcome the digital divide. It's not just a question of greater access to digital resources. But before we go into the Q&A, I just want to get a bit of a temperature check and ask the panelists, a really brief answer would be great, but what is the trajectory of this problem? Are we resolving it? Is it getting better, either in the long term or in the more, in terms of COVID? Or is this something that is getting worse and really needs to be arrested and stopped? And you can answer that through the different lenses that your presentations took. Teddy, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts on that one?
Sure, I can do that. Thanks, Ross. Not to be fully pessimistic, but I would say we not on a great trajectory. I think it is too easy for the problem we see right now is that the digital divide is replicating the analog inequalities in the world that exist, whether that is gender, geography, income, race, and is replicating them online. And in a lot of ways, that comes out of the simple fact that those privileged communities in the real world are typically more profitable to serve as customers in an online world, in terms of whose ad dollars do you want to sell, who do you want as customers if you're an internet service provider. And so it's breaking that logic, I think, is a fundamental part to us rethinking and reapproaching this question. And so I think there is definitely progress in the sense of more governments are more interested in having more people online, but I do think they're going to take an easy approach if they can, which is to prioritize quick gains in cities, in urban areas, amongst privileged communities, rather than doing the hard work that really does need to be done to not let the internet become another means by which we have haves and have-nots, privileged and unprivileged communities. And I don't think we're there yet, unfortunately.
It's quick wins and headline results that governments will be attracted to.
Exactly.
Beatrice, if you want to answer that question next about where we're going on this question.
Well, I share Teddy's perspective on this. Not willing to be too pessimistic, but inequalities are growing. And the consequences of this pandemic, this global pandemic, is showing how inequalities are growing. For example, we could talk about something different than the big tech things with the access to vaccines. So that shows how inequality is growing and deepening this gap between the privileged societies and privileged and all the other people that we are leaving behind. It's like there are countries that they are not having enough doses to inoculate their population, and there are countries that are having a lot of vaccines, not using them, or even having a good portion of the communities refusing to get vaccines. So with the social consequences that this has. So even while I share with Teddy the idea that it's interesting that many governments are paying attention, I think that we still need a lot of information on how this digital economy works. And that's why I'm happy to be here around rethinking economics, because I think it's a matter of rethinking economics. What we need, it's another perspective on economics, especially turning down this idea of concentration that brought us here. We have to think how to limit this kind of concentration, how to limit this data harvesting that the big tech are doing with our countries, how to empower our own societies in this economy, how to develop these capacities to turn down this paradigm that we are living in. So I'm not absolutely pessimistic, but I'm not optimistic at all.
Benjamin, if you want to give your thoughts on that question, what trajectory are we going in?
Well, I think solving a problem is first ability to identify it. So the fact that we are getting more consensus on these issues, and if we stay true to the cause of it, I think for the big tech or the people in charge benefiting won't solve the problem. So it's those who the shoe is pinching who have to speak up. As we're beginning to speak up and it's becoming more reverberating almost everywhere, I think in that direction, I think we're going well. Like we just need to build more consensus around it and sound it everywhere it matters. So not just talking about it in a bubble, but taking it to broader conversations and saying, this is what we want, because the big techs do what they do best, or the winners of this game do what they do best by one way or the other pushing their agenda. So for instance, you see call for data, call for AI, almost everything must have AI right now. And after, the next thing on AI is the demand for data. So that is not the agenda of people in digital divide. That's not what we need. Give me food, give me education, give me, so in terms of identifying the problem, I think we're going in the right trajectory. And I think if we continue in that motion, gradually we'll start changing things. But will it be easy? I don't think so. Because those already have still so much cash or business out of this won't want to let it go. But then, because it's our survival, we just need to keep pushing at it until we get, and as we get more people on board to the argument, then I think we will make progress. So in that direction, I'm kind of optimistic, and it's what committing to. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
I think that's a nice framing. Let's frame this as realism rather than pessimism. And if we've now been realistic about the state of the problem, I think a few of the questions provide a fruitful ground for discussion of what those solutions might be. So the questions we've got are all been sent anonymously. If you have a question and you would like to present it yourself, put your name down and we'll bring you on stage. But I'll kick us off with the most upvoted question. And I'll probably start off by directing it to the member of the panel who I think where it most relates to their presentation. But if you would like to contribute after that's taken place, there'll also be space for that as well. And the first question is, I'll direct it to Teddy first. And it says, how do we change the culture around women and content creation? Education is really important, but even to get girls to engage with that education, it needs to stop being seen as a boys' thing.
Yeah, in some ways, I'd almost say, unfortunately, the situation is that not even that education. It is education is a thing for boys, not for girls. And that's the crucial first part. Like, we have to overcome that. You have to overcome literacy gaps, education gaps, the idea that girls should be sent to stay home and learn housekeeping rather than getting into secondary and tertiary education. That's the first part that has to be broken. I think in addition, and that's kind of, there's three parts. There's that part about education. There's another part that I think is about social media, or not social media use, but technology use in general, in terms of gender perceptions. And in several parts of the world, the perception of a woman online is she is promiscuous, she is unfaithful, she is, negative connotations. Whereas if a man is using a mobile phone, he is, tech savvy, he's entrepreneurial, it's all these positive things. That logic has to switch. We have to break down gender norms that say that women should not be participating in the online world. That's a crucial part. So they have to be able to, education has to be an equal right. Digital technology has to be an equal right. And then the last thing I really want to emphasize is, I think, then overcoming those barriers, which are huge barriers in their own right, thinking about kind of what are potentially more practical steps as well. It's also thinking about the experiences people are having online, and particularly experiences around online gender-based violence. So if you think about, a male or, a man or a woman, or even, a non-binary individual participating in an online space in social media, the receptions they get are typically very different. Women in general, particularly women in public positions who are using social media, receive a lot more hate comments, a lot more death threats. And that has a huge mental health effect, huge effect in chilling and reducing the amount people are going to want to put themselves out there. And so we have to confront that barrier as well. And so I think there's a lot around policies that can be changed for social media platforms in terms of muting hateful content, allowing people to curate their own experiences so that they're able to protect their own mental health, but also, develop the communities that they want to develop with other people like themselves. And so I think those are three areas of particular attention that we need to think about when we're talking about, changing the gender divide and changing kind of perceptions of what are boys' things to do and what are girls' things to do, and the expectation that there are things that boys should do and girls should do. It's things that people should do is the ideal in my world.
Much, Teddy. Beatrice, yeah.
And to add to what Teddy already mentioned, I would like to bring to the table the another concept that it's crucial to reach this problem, is that the care economy. Here at Rethinking Economics, you invited Mercedes D'Alessandro, who works here in Argentina. She's an economist that I've seen her in the program with a team of women here in Argentina working on the care economy. And there is also a new Ministry of Women and Diversities here in Argentina in the new government. So I think we cannot put this aside from the inequalities, the social inequalities that women are still having, where I think we have to put the care economy in the first place, because if you don't have your own time, your autonomy to have your own time, education is, of course, one very, very important issue. But for example, here in Argentina, where the public university is free and open for everyone, we have a lot of women doing university careers. So it's not only the issue of education. Education is fundamental, but not enough. Having your own time, your own autonomy, and I think to get that, the care economy should be put on the table.
Thanks very much. And Ben, I don't know if you've got any thoughts you'd like to add to that question, or yeah, okay. We'll go on to the next one then, which is,
well,
sorry.
I'm not, okay. Let's go to the next one.
Great. So the next question is, in regard to the wiki community, the Creative Commons community, etc., this is still perceived as quite unorthodox. Do any of the speakers have ideas on how to bring this into the mainstream? And by the wiki community, Creative Commons community, I think it's referring to the use of products, digital or physical, that don't have these copyrights attached to them. And Beatrice, I think that probably relates to your talk the most, so we'll start off with you if that's all right.
Fantastic questions. We are still doing ourselves. It's hard to put these issues on mainstream, because as free software communities, we don't have the same capacity as the big tech. But for example, in the free software movement, there's a lot of people using free software without knowing that they are using free software. And in fact, it's one of the more successful stories is the use, the global use of free software in the big tech industry. Most of what we call the GAFA, Google, Amazon, they are using free software. They are having people from the free software community within their employees. They're going to search for employees to the free software community events. So I think the free software community made it to the mainstream. I'm not sure if we are happy with the results, because most of the consequences of this of the use of this free software within companies like Google, for example, ended up with harvesting data and other issues that free software community is paying attention, but which is not part of the core of the issue on copyright and copyleft and so on. I think we have it harder with the copyright on other issues like music and educational materials, and I think what we need to do or to push for is to public policies. I think the open access policies, the public policies. Sorry, my dog is. I'm sorry. It's like it's a puppy. But what we have to push for is for public policies. For example, for access to academical materials, for educational materials. And so I think the only way we have to go mainstream is through public policies.
Thanks very much. I don't know if either of the other two speakers want to feed in at all on that question. Terry, you're going to go first?
Just to quickly say, I think it's a great question, a fantastic one that I hope that we all as a wide collective can take up. I guess one of the things that always inspires me, and I think inspires but also can create pessimism, is being part of the World Wide Web Foundation. One of the stories we like to say is how one of our founders, Tim Berners-Lee, as the inventor of the web, one of the remarkable things of his action was he gifted that code, he gifted that technology to the public domain. And actions like that are much more rare in this space than they once were. And I think that's an unfortunate thing that we've seen of the arc of the development of digital technologies, is not so much of this gifting things back into the public domain and allowing things growing. And so I think in a lot of ways it's rethinking, what are the major contributions that happen in this field? It's not necessarily creating the next big social media platform that's locked into copyrights. It's about creating innovative web standards or technologies that are then leveraged and given out to other people to do incredible things as well. And so I think that's a bit of the future I hope that we can see as we're rethinking the digital divide and these questions in the future.
Benji.
Yeah. So when it comes to open source, it's a privilege that someone who already has a tummy filled and comfortable thing can venture into. And that's why a whole lot of time open source in the communities that I've been functioning, it's pretty tough to find people to really commit to, because there's the question of what is the need for me. Even if you are altruistic in your way of life, you're going to struggle for a long time. And that's where development organizations really come in to really put the weight behind what they say. Not you came in and say you're not for profit, but you recruited you are using all the for profit tools. You're not going, the way we evaluate skills should be on enthusiasm, passion. In that way, then you find people who their passion has led to something, not politically correct or visibility. I mean, genuine people who are making difference won't have time to make video to show what they are doing. And that's the way the world has turned to. So everybody is doing something for some kind of capital gain. And that is why you find less commitment, even by people who have time, who are in the inequality, or who to commit to that because they don't see a way out of it to improve their lot, to get them better accommodation, to give them minimal living standards. And sometimes also the big tech has made it some kind of rabbit hole when people develop amazing open source tool. They just come when they start getting traction to buy it off. So in the end, it's also, yes, you told everybody it was open source, but now it got traction, boom, it's commercialized. And then you see all those politically correct public media stunts, PR, and you just want to throw up. So what I would say is open source has a future for the comfortable, but for the marginalized, it's not the best way to go. I've tried a lot to get people around, let's do this something amazing, but if the dude is hungry, it's not going to work. So most times you now find people who are overly privately invested, who has a long-term goal, come make it look like it's open source tool, get people on board, give people money, and then they build some energy around it. Then, because it takes a lot of work to figure out things you need to do in open source, no documentation, you have to form that. Somebody has to pay for all of that. And my take would be to see open source grow, people to accept it. People don't have problem accepting if it works, but it might also be like the big tech too and all of that, because in the end, when it gets proper traction, they don't remember those of you who tested it out, give feedback, they just sell out to the big tech, and then you start again. So that's what I see. But it's just, it would have been useful if we can create it as well. But those economic disparities won't make that easily done. Thank you.
I think I'll actually, the next question, I think dovetails quite well with what you were just saying there, Benjamin, that it's right to say that when we talk about open source programs and open source data, that is at present still a fringe community. We're working to bring that into the mainstream, but as you said, for many communities, an option that is more expensive, even if it's or not, but it's an option that's more difficult to use or inaccessible, will be turned down in favor of some of these big tech options. This reminds me of a conversation I was actually having this morning when people were talking about the uptake of technology and greater use of technology more widely within Saudi Arabia with the oil boom, and how everybody in Saudi Arabia now has a phone as opposed to, a decade ago, 15 years ago. But as a result of that, you cannot go anywhere within Saudi Arabia without security forces knowing exactly where you are due to the tech that Google has on those phones. So the greater use of technology having a very useful impact that we've talked about, but also potentially being very supportive to oppressive regimes around the world. And if we're going to try and convince, the question here has a lot of qualifiers, is it marginalized countries, communities, peoples to accept tech that doesn't have these problems? What's the best way of doing that? Whereas that's another big question. But Benjamin, I don't know if you want to take that one first, kind of how do we avoid the big tech taking over this issue and potentially having very negative impacts?
I think I would try to take on that. The only way we could do that is, first of all, if they want, we need to identify the fact that we have some value to offer the big tech. And also come to the reality that some of the challenges we have right now are not just good to have. They are like health, agriculture, and all of that. There are social services that we need. It's not fair for big tech to leverage on that to further their cause of commercializing things. So for us is to get involved and negotiate either as a group of collectives. Maybe multiple countries come together in developing countries and say, see, we want to use this technology. However, you need to also participate in our local economy. You need to maybe build an office, recruit people who will pay. In that sense, we don't want helicopter style. You just send your platform to us. You have no direct impact of what is happening. You're just in wherever, and we're just using your technology, and you're just harvesting resources from us. No, so government needs to show by either putting some kind of incentives for them to come locally, or putting some taxes to make them, if they take this much from us, they have to make their own contribution to the economy as well. That's one of the ways that will motivate them. And then also, every technology they're offering, it must be community relevant. You just don't bring template from somewhere and then have one marketer in your community who is well paid, selling it everywhere. No, everyone has to show interest. And in that way, we just need to engage them. I don't know the way to the future, but I know that with this present way is not working. And it's for us to be bold enough to engage them, especially we should know our worth, how much from us they take, and use that as a bargaining chip to have a renegotiation of model. This existing model doesn't work.
Be enough, Benjamin, knowing that what is current state of things isn't working. We don't need to know a solution. We know it currently isn't working. But I'll open up the floor if anyone else wants to respond to that question about, Beatrice, if you can go first. And then to Teddy.
I'd like to stress a few words that Benjamin said and make them mine as well. Tax, and public policies and tax. And and to fight against concentration, I think we have to promote interoperability. And to promote interoperability, we have to try to find the way to impose open standards. So we can innovate, we can create new businesses, we have a more diversity in the big tech community, because as Benjamin already said, you have an idea, you develop, you innovate, and then the big tech comes and buys you, and no more diversity. And I think interoperability is a key issue. Taxes is a key issue, and the right to repair is a key issue. So, and most of these issues are bringing us back to my main concern, which is intellectual property. So we have to have enough flexibilities to do interoperability. I'm sorry, it's so hard. Interoperability. We have to have the capacity to build our own technologies, and we have to have the capacity to support our own infrastructures, and we have to have the capacity as countries to have public policies to deal with concentration and to tax all that people that is making money in our country. That's simple. That's so simple, not so simple, but.
And if I can just add as well, from my perspective, I think there's like another example we can add of how the current system is not working, why we need to change, and then kind of thinking about like, so what do we do in response? What do we change? And kind of building what Beatrice and Benjamin said. With example of what is wrong, one of the things that we look at the Alliance is zero rating of data. And so zero rating as a practice is this idea that typically many people will buy kind of a data cap from their mobile network provider. So for example, for me, I'll just use myself as a benchmark. I get 10 gigabytes per month that I can use however I want to surf the web on whatever websites I want to surf. A number of those operators will set up contractual arrangements where they will zero rate, which is effectively not charge you or not charge customers for using specific sites. And in particular, the sites that are going to, sites or applications that are going to be advantaged from that, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram. And I would say in particular, those 4 apps benefit the most because they get used as advertising tools to sell more data. It's like, oh, but you also, if you choose us, you get these apps for free, which then encourages them to use those apps more because it's zero rated, and it just kind of builds into this cycle of locking people in on those apps with those operators. I think we have to think about ways of breaking that chain and really discouraging that practice of zero rating, which will encourage people, I think, and intuitively it breaks that logic of it simply isn't more expensive to use alternatives because everything's being charged at the same rate. And so that's the problem, and I think an illustration of why we need to change things. Thinking about how do we change things now, one of the things I would like to see more from a public policy perspective is in many countries around the world, there are these institutions called universal service funds. And the way that they work is they are kind of just an arm's length away from governments, but they essentially collect typically like 1, 2, maybe 3% of profits from internet service providers, pool all of that funding together, and then allocate to projects that are in the public interest, not necessarily profit interest. And typically these organizations focus on providing infrastructure solutions and infrastructure in new areas. And that's a core part that still needs to be part of a universal service fund mandate. But in addition to that, some of the most leading practices that we see and innovative practices we see in parts of the world is those universal service funds funding the generation of new local content. And I think here's a really interesting point where we can bring together Benjamin's point about not creating templates that are just being replicated around the world. It's universal funds supporting local development of new content in local languages, local interests. And with Beatrice's perspective on interoperability, make that a requirement. If it's a procurement process and a competitive bidding process, say, oh, also, if you want our money, you need to make your standards interoperable so people can use their data and shop around and leave your platform if they want to. I think this is potentially a very small way we can bend the arc towards a more just place in the future. So yeah, I'll stop there for now.
That's great. Thanks very much to all our panelists for working in the terms of optimistic realism, giving some avenues for hope on this issue. I'm going to quote Monty Python, the British sketch show, and say now for something completely different. But the final question we've got is an interesting one, and I'm not quite sure who to put it to. So if you'd like to to answer it, then feel free to unmute yourself. But the question is, could the power of influencers be harnessed in closing the digital divide? Are the new social media careers being created by social media, are they potentially more viable for women who can do it from home and on their own time? So if you've thoughts on this, feel free to unmute yourself.
Sure, I can come in on this one of potentially, to give a really unsatisfying single word answer. The two things that are in my mind are, yes, there's greater freedom and possibilities in this realm, but I return back to online gender-based violence as a huge point of concern. If you compare what are the perceptions of female influencers versus male influencers, what is the amount of abuse that they are receiving on platforms, even despite having very similar behaviors as content creators, I have some skepticism about the potential for that being an equalizing force in terms of income and empowerment across gender. But one of the things I do want to say is I think there's a lot of realm of thinking about creativity in terms of the digital economy from a gendered perspective. And if I can plug a bit of our work that is forthcoming, we are doing a research project around the costs of exclusion, which is the idea of what is the economic cost of all of these social norms that discourage women from being online. It's still ongoing, but if you pay attention to the Alliance kind of later this year, we will publish this research, and it asks a lot of these questions of like, so what are women doing online? What are perceptions of women who are content creators in different parts of the world? And what are some potential ways forward from a public policy perspective that we can kind of create a more gender equitable world online and offline?
Beatrice?
Yes, I'm a little bit about the idea of going back home for women. It's living home is one of the main things that women's movement made in the last decades. So going to the public sphere, going to work, getting out our homes is a big issue for women. So I'm not sure about this idea of going back home as an alternative. Also, as Teddy mentioned on regarding violence against women, with the lockdowns and the situation in the COVID-19 pandemics, at least here in Argentina, where we have, I know the numbers, the violence against women within their homes increased a lot. So I'm not sure about the idea of bringing us back home as something that is that has a good as a good idea, and also the idea of having our own time for women. Being at home means taking care of the family, the children, the cooking, the cleaning, and all the care economy. So I think unless we solve these issues on the care economy, going back home is not what I expected.
We're almost reaching the end of this session, but I'm going to give all the speakers one more opportunity to go around. So Benjamin, if you want to think about any reflections on that question, but also I'd ask you to end with telling our audience the one thing that you would like them to leave with. Is that a fact? Is that a question that they take away with? If you leave with if they leave only with one thing from you, what is it? And also, if it'd be useful, you can share any programs or ways that people can keep in touch with your work. So,
Okay.
Benjamin, then we'll go Teddy, and then Beatrice.
Ross. Okay. Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Beatrice, Teddy. It's been an amazing, eye-opening session, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. In terms of influencers, I will quickly say that remember, it's also a template. How you behave on Instagram is not just the way Instagram is. Yeah, I studied persuasive technology. So all of those things they are doing, the remote control is in Silicon Valley. So a lot of, I don't have hope that it could do good to 10 people, but mislead 5 million people. So depending on who it pays in the long term. So I would take it with a pinch of salt. And right now, the research we're doing is like social media is, the algorithm is doing badly with students. It's especially African students. Culturally, it has upended our value systems. So you can take it however you want to take it, but we should take it with a pinch of salt. The algorithms are not fair. Drag people to rabbit hole. Finally, if I wanted to remember anything, is that whenever we think about technology, we should think about it in our context, culturally relevant. So that's, for me, it's the whole concept of social innovation. Any technology that robs us of the ingenuineness that our environment gives us is not fair to us. So we should always look at how to use technology to be culturally relevant and also be mindful. We should change. I also want us to think about the future, about data, right? Whatever, we should change the conversation around data. We should have access to our rights on over our data. So thank you. Follow Spider, the Swedish. They've been supporting our work, ICT for Social Innovation. We're around Africa, and you can look me up on all the social media. My name is easily to find. And I'm going to contact all these panelists after this conversation. Thank you, Rethink. I appreciate you.
Perfect. Yeah, and just to kind of build onto the train, again, thanks to both my co-panelists as well, and Ross, to you for chairing our session. We're definitely staying in touch after this session. There have been a lot of really great reflections and interventions over this kind of past 90 minutes or so. I think from my perspective, besides the fact that digital divide is sexist, which I led with, to close with, I think the thing that's currently milling on my head is that the internet is just a piece of technology. And that can both be a source of power, but also kind of a rationalization aspect of, it can do tremendous things as technology has done tremendous things. It can also do horrible things, as many forms of new technology have done horrible things to the natural world, to humanity. And I think in a lot of ways, it's up to us, through public policy, through advocacy, through agitating for change, that determines what that technology is going to do. But it itself is just a piece of technology. We are the ones who hold the power that decide what that technology is going to do for us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure joining the panel. For sure, I will keep in touch with my colleagues. And what I would like to stress is that the COVID pandemic is a tragic moment for humanity. My solidarity and warm for all the people that lost beloved ones in this pandemic. But the COVID-19 didn't bring anything new to the table. It just accelerated trends that were there, and inequality is the main issue we have to address, not only for the post-pandemic scenario, but for other crises we as humanity have to deal with together, like, for example, climate crisis and all the events that we are seeing around the world. So I think what we have to learn is that we have to deal with all these tragedies and situations together. If not together, none of us will be safe.
And I think that's a very fitting sentiment to close the session on. Thank you again to everyone that come to the session. Thank you to the wonderful panelists. Thank you to Mila, who couldn't be here today, but put all the thinking behind this session. We hope to see you at sessions later in the day. I have just shared the schedule. But once again, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.